about later tonight. So I'll just tell you a little bit about our guests before I hand you over. Sally Festing has ventured into journalism, radio plays, academic studies, penguin biographies and other non-fiction, all before moving into the world of poetry and having her work recognised by large publications and competitions. She used to chair the Leicester Poetry Society and ran a Poetry Society stanza in Manningtree, and also held the Saltmarsh Poetry Readings in North Norfolk's Burnhams until the pandemic began. And then up first tonight we'll be hearing from Peter Wallis, who is a poet, adjudicator and mentor. He's a Hawthornden Fellow 2021, a former Eastern Arts Association visiting writer and primary school poet in residence. Peter is currently submissions editor for UK charity Poems in the Waiting Room, and he's had his work published extensively and been shortlisted and longlisted for the National Poetry Competition. So that's enough from me, but I'm so pleased to welcome to the Harbour Room Sally Festing and Peter Wallis. And I wondered if we could begin tonight by if you could explain why it is that you read together and how this synergy sort of came about. I'll leave that over to you.
Well, I've known Sally for, I'm guessing 8 or 9 years, and it came about in North Norfolk. I had a poem that was commended in the Wells poetry competition. I didn't win a prize, and I didn't have to go to the presentation, but I did and went on my own. Because I think if you win something and you want to be involved in poetry, you should try and support it at whatever level you can. So I was there on my own, and Sally came and saw me and sat next to me, and we got chatting, obviously. And she said, I don't suppose you'd drive up to Burnham Overy Staithe for a poetry evening. And I thought, well, people drive from this part of the world down to Fakenham or King's Lynn or Norwich all the time. Why not? So I started going to her poetry evenings, and we became friends. And we belonged to some of the same poetry groups, the Norwich Stanza. And but Sally writes quite quickly, and she likes feedback quite quickly. So we very soon started sending each other poems for comment and criticism as they were being drafted. So that's how the friendship is sustained. And then we both had bodies of poems that were related to the head. Sally's because her father set up the Mental Health Foundation, and so that deals with the head in sort of mental sense. And I've got poems about hospital life and the head in a physical sense. So we've put the two together, and we've done several readings under the headlines.
Thank you. I don't think I have anything to add to that, Florrie.
Shall we begin with the first reading by Peter? So Peter, if you're ready, it'll be fantastic to hear some of your work.
That's fine, I should leave the mic. I'll need my glasses. And brief but sincere thanks to Florrie and Homestage for inviting us to read. Thanks to the people who have come along in person. It's not to be taken as an everyday event because it's very early after the easing of restrictions in the pandemic. And thanks to the people who have come along online. We know you're there. Thanks to the journals that published some of these poems originally too. My reading's in 2 parts, and there are 8 poems in each part, so you've got some idea where we are. The poems are from a longer sequence of poems called Half Other. They're both biographical and autobiographical because they're about life as an identical twin. The first part of the reading is about growing up and being at school as an identical twin. The later poems are about adult life and subsequent events. The first poems come from my pamphlet called Articles of Twinship, which is available. If anybody wants to buy it, it's available from my website, peterwallis.co.uk. If you contact me, on the contact page. And I've got copies here tonight. And my brother and I were born 9 minutes apart. And so I wondered, what else could you do in 9 minutes other than give birth to identical twins? So this poem is the result. It's born 1954, 1:45, 1:54 p.m. In the time it might take to heat a pan of frozen peas or boil 2 eggs consecutively. For an aunt to cast on a doll's bonnet, considering the size of the firstborn, or rather lack of it. Time to register the shock, or microwave a chocolate cake. Make 9-minute Carolyn curried eggs, or undertake Chris and Heidi Powell's miracle workout. Alternatively, listen to Black Sabbath's God is Dead, or read Shakespeare's sonnets from the fairest creatures we desire increase to that on himself such murderous shame commits, or free fall 24 miles from space as Felix Baumgartner, which, after all, has equivalence to what the twins did. People are generally interested in twins when they see them, identical twins, particularly if they're dressed alike. And it's a strange but true thing that my brother and I can't recognise ourselves on family photos, even reliably until we're in our 30s. So the next poem is called Identical. Please bring a photo of yourself as a baby for an identification game. Which is which? It's a game every time. I remember this being taken, the rough sofa, being told to smile, but we're lost to ourselves. This one is John, a little fuller in the face. Peter, with his head down, he'd always draw in his chin. It's Christmas. We're in the front room. Mum, smiling, young, her own teeth and beautiful, sleepy eyes, glad to be still. Dad, behind the settee, clean cut, in front of the tree, his hair thinning. So a grandparent took it? 4 boys look up. Steve on the left, Andy right. In the middle, the twins. All wearing shorts with long grey socks turned over elastic, shirts, collars, home-knitted pullovers, and ties. There'd be the giveaways, 1 orange and 1 red. Both had a pattern of cowboys, but the Kodak is colourblind. And here we are again, more than 9, because that's when Heather was born, and Heather's on Tom. That must be Peter, holding the rein. This one, just a little fuller in the face. Does this one have his head down? One had a mole. And so it goes on. Not a single photo of a twin on his own. The next poem, we're at school. It's called The Days Bring What They Will, and it has a line by Glyn Maxwell. And his line is, "And the world sits on the windowsill again." And it mentions Marion Richardson. That was the name of a handwriting script that was used in primary schools when we were very young. The days bring what they will. The windows, being high but tall, do little more than let some light in, or the sound and patterns of rain. They open on a fascinating system of pulleys, poles, ropes, and O-rings. Everything has a film of chalk dust, deep enough in places to misspell your own name in. Safe imprisonment, bells, routine, onward Christian soldiers Friday afternoons. There's a nature table for brought-in conkers, yellow leaves and shells, that sort of thing, each with a tentative card and script in Marion Richardson. Miss Crowther, not unkindly, calls our names again and, like a deacon, reels us in with our responses. Innocently, we sing her psalm. The days bring what they will. Baker, Julie, ward sister, plastic flowers and red ribbon on a tree. Present, Barden, Alan, divorced twice, Thai bride. Present, Bloom, Judy, our little angel, always in our hearts. Present, Campbell, Philip, GP, FRCS, MRCP, OBE. Present, all 31 are told. Then our desks yawn and slam, releasing pencil shavings and wax crayons, all rubbed brown and peeling in their tobacco tins. Look up, and the world sits on the windowsill again. A few chrysanthemums in season, paintbrushes in a jar like captured Indians. Rule a line or turn to a clean page. Copy the date. Underline, begin. Being a twin, people often assume that it's a wonderful thing, like having a secret friend and somebody always there for you, as they say these days. And that's all true. We're very fortunate as twins. We have our soulmate from the word go. Some people spend a lifetime searching. But we also have double anxiety. It's double everything. And there's a strand of anxiety in some of these poems. This one is in, round, through, off. Little Miss Shipley taught us to knit. Goodness knows how she did it. Over 30 7-year-olds at desks in rows, side by side like human stitches. 10 cast on the left needle. Right and left are themselves challenges. In, round, through, off. We work them again and again like breathing, in plain knit. Garter stitch, as she calls it, though it's neckties we're making. In, round, through, off. In, round, through, off. I'm addicted. My tie grows like a year, day by day. It can go home to be finished. The summer warms. We siblings holiday without parents. My aunt is eccentric. Gardens in Wellingtons and petticoat. No point in dirtying a dress when nobody comes and the path to the road is so long. Trees quietly turn their embroideries. The hot days are delirious. But Aunt Gwen frightens us boys with Hound of the Baskervilles on the radio in the long, fading evenings, then creeps upstairs growling to where we lie on a bed on the floor in the darkness. The house frightens us with unfamiliar noises. Suddenly, from nowhere, I know I will die, but not when or how. It feels soon. Homesick, I lie in the black, too scared to cry. Next day, Aunt knits, and she encourages us. It's nothing unusual. Winter evenings, my farm labourer uncle works cross-stitch for presents. I knit obsessively too, blanking out thought, time, blanking myself with ceaseless activity. In, round, through, off, my mantra for fingers. Needles tick, in, round, through, off. Squares grow like months of a year, completing a life. In, round, through, off. I steadily work at my blanket. Back to school and that idea of twins being both a comfort and a source of concern for each other. This poem was first published in Poetry News, and it's called Novelty Race. Three-legged, most kids rollick along like good-natured argument. Naturally, the twins get it right and stride off in time, like a well-made dovetail, joint, a catamaran or skull. They pulse out in front, pulse to the finish line, laugh as they double or halve their one sporting moment in a half sporting triumph. I read you the poem Identical about how we look from outside. I tried in this next poem to give an idea of how it feels to be identical sort of from the inside. It's called The Subtle Art of Crossing a Road. When we drift to the edge of the pavement, nothing's been said. Simply, we move as a shoal, a pod of two, taking a curve. The one on the outside lengthens his stride. The other slows automatically. Turning our heads is a murmuration of starlings at dusk. When we look left, right, left, it's the Green Cross Code choreographed. We step off the curb, synchronized, like a Tai Chi evening class. Mounting the other side, we're circus. We're noticed. We're liberty horses lifting our hooves to no applause. The next poem moves us forward from being identical at school to the business of becoming unidentical as adults. You might remember or have seen this advert for Start Right shoes. The two children holding hands walking down that long, narrowing road. Children's shoes have far to go. Their factory dwarfs the school, and at 7, we are the innocent Start Right twins, taken to try on shoes. Fitters look and look again because we're almost indistinguishable. Adverts declare that well begun is half done, but the path is long and vanishing. As we grow, you tangle with all things medical until it's cyst, benign, and loss of peripheral vision. Engulfed by 4 brain operations, John, I become your road not taken. I clasp your hand and you clutch mine. I am aghast as you're brought down again and again, my twin, and struggle up a changed man. Your face stove in, you're blind, forgetful, drug-dependent, hunched, bloated and vulnerable. I am an embarrassment of health. Now when people look, they seek an explanation. The final poem in this set. When my brother was becoming ill, I was an infants teacher. And so the next poem is called Teddy Bear's Picnic. My plan, all in the hall this afternoon, 200 infants plus their furry friends, but not their best, I insist, in case of loss, distress, lonely nights and sleeplessness. During the morning, the secretary takes a call. Could I meet my twin at lunchtime? Our parents drop him off, leave us alone, and we stroll in a bleak park opposite the school. He's come to say goodbye and ask a question. Given his recently announced marriage plans, could he still put me down as next of kin? Of course, it's obvious to me, always has been. It's urgent. Addenbrooke's this afternoon. He leaves, and I go in for registration, struggling. The party's kicking off. I have to sing as best I can, If You Go Down. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for a fantastic first reading. Now, this is a portion of the event where we can have some questions from the audience if anyone has any. I thought that I would just kick off the questions myself. So something that I noticed was that throughout that reading, a lot of the poems were obviously reflecting on childhood. And then you mentioned in one how it had sort of developed into adulthood. But that's kind of what I wanted to ask you about, was how Twinship had developed into adulthood, and if you do tend to look back on your childhood with nostalgia in a way.
That's a very good question. How it developed will become apparent in the second half of the reading, but you already know from what I've said so far that it involves illness, brain operations and Addenbrooke's Hospital. So that gives you some idea, and I am still the embarrassment of health. So fortunately, our paths have taken divergent courses as adults in terms of health. Our childhood, yes, quite very loving home and close family, large family. There's nothing I would want to go back for, to go back and do again, but we had lots of fun as twins. For example, well, everybody when we started school, at 5 years old, had to wear name badges. Everybody else could take theirs off when the teacher had got the hang of who was who. We had to wear ours a lot longer, and of course, we didn't always wear the right one. So that was obvious. But then even in the sixth form, we were given economics homework, and we had to prepare a talk to the class, and the teacher said, would John go and give his talk to the class? John hadn't done his homework, so he hadn't got a talk ready. I had done my homework, so I had my talk ready, and although everybody else in the class knew it was the wrong twin, the teacher had no idea. So that we got away with that, until at lunchtime we passed the teacher and he said, I want a word with you. And I thought, oh no, he's found out. But it wasn't that. He just wanted to say, I thought that was a really good talk. But the odd thing about that story is that when I tell the story, I'm the person who's done the homework. And when John tells the story, he's the person who's done the homework. And that's not us trying to to change history. It's just that I have my individual memories, he has his individual memories, but we do have this bank of shared memories, things that we know happened, but somehow it's not important to us which person it happened to. We just know it happened.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask at this point in the reading?
The obvious one, Florrie, is what does John think about Peter's poems about him?
I can come to you directly, actually.
Yeah.
We have him here
yes,
tonight.
John is here, so he can answer.
I'm always impressed by the truth that Peter tells. The experience, you can guess, gets heavier when the hospital gets involved. There's brain tumour and all of that. And yet Peter is able to write about it, to express it, to be honest, but he also has a lightness of touch and humour, and that always impresses me. So it's his honesty, really, is what impresses me. And Peter said he is an embarrassment of health. I feel sometimes I'm just an embarrassment.
Well, I'd contradict that. He's never an embarrassment, and he's always full of good humour and wit. And he makes a very good first critic. When I've written something, I don't make a routine of it, but John is often the first person to read it. And if I have a doubt about something or I've had to rework something and I'm not 100% sure myself, he can pick that up and will question the doubtful bit or make a suggestion, or he's very acute as a first reader. So he's helpful to me in that way. And when it comes to truth, that's a complex question, because poems obviously don't have to be literally true, although the poems in this sequence are based on facts of our lives. But when I was working with children, I always used to ask them to tell me what poetry is, and when we talked about it, I would say to them that the definition of poetry that I worked to was a pattern of words filled with ideas and having something to do with the truth. Because I think people read poetry not usually just as escapism, but to find out something about themselves or their lives or the human condition or whatever it is. So they have to ring true in some way or have some bearing on truth, whether it's a dream truth or an imaginative truth, but there has to be some element of truth.
Do we have any more questions from the audience before we head over to Peter's second reading? I don't think so. Peter,
No?
are you
Okay,
ready to
well,
go
I
ahead?
can tell you what happens next. I should need the microphone.
Yes, if you stand between me and the light, can you?
Oh.
Can you? Oh, no, a little bit to the right, please. Oh, thank you.
Okay, well, I was this infants teacher, but John was ahead of me. He was the youngest head teacher in Norfolk. But ill health took over and has dominated his life and therefore mine since we were in our 30s. The next poem is called Cyst. Cyst disappears like a hair in its form, lies still as a plum at a harvest festival. Divorce is cyst in translation. It's a brown rat holed up under the cooker, sullying the kitchen. Cyst wants to test Archimedes' principle. Unsafely tucked up at home, Cyst sees himself as the grit in a pearl. Cyst supports a black economy, has filled out no forms, has no means of identification. Cyst is the quiet neighbour who keeps himself to himself, is something concealed in the hold of your brain. Craniopharyngioma, an essential guide. It could be you. Let me explain. It's not for everyone, not for the squeamish. Think invasive. Think burnt mouth, wrinkled skin, the taste of blood. Think dentist. Then I'll help you with endoscopic transphonoidal surgery. To reach a spot dead center of your head next to your pituitary, imagine this, you're flat out. The surgeon makes an incision behind your top lip where flesh meets gum. He's flensing up to get into your skull through your nasal cavity, up and under your slack brain, feeling for something, a bulge, the size of, say, a yielding walnut, lancing it and drawing off fluid. But the cyst's refilling. As he backs out, job incomplete, he posits a more direct approach within weeks. So he went on to have 3 more brain operations, leaving him registered blind and with complex medical needs. Hospital bed. You wear the bed like an exoskeleton. You wear the bed as compensation for the failure of your body's intricate contraption. You writhe in bed like a lobster in bentwood and netting. You wear the bed the way a bird wears a cage or a fly wears a web. You wear the bed like a flat pack, half completed. You wear the bed like a butter dish, or a design by Vivienne Westwood. You wear the bed the way a tongue wears a mouth, or a cyst wears your head. The title of this next poem is in the voice of a 7-year-old girl. And my granddad's in a hospital in Stevenage. And all my own grandparents are under roses at St. Faith's, and my oldest brother's in an office job in Greenwich, and my second brother's been bereaved and fosters babies up in Leeds, and my mother's clattering in her kitchen in the suburbs, and my dad is furiously digging muck and prays at his allotment, and my archaeologist sister's digging Norfolk on her knees, and my wife's up to her eyes and ears in our mid-terrace, and 2 boys under 5, OU, and the early years of marriage. My twin is in a neurosurgery ward at Addenbrooke's, and I am hearing news, trapped in an infant classroom back in Norwich. And the next poem was shortlisted in the 2016 National Poetry Competition. It came about because I was at a workshop and I was asked to write a poem about phones. And I didn't have a smartphone at the time, so I had to look back to a time when a payphone was important to me, essential to me. What can I say? The phones are on the basement landing near the lifts and wearing hoods like hairdryers. They feed on cash, but are essential. They sleep on hooks like babies put to rest face down. They all trail cords twisted as messages. Among evidence of crisps and gum, the phones are dreaming grubby dreams graffitied on the dimpled walls. They hang their heads as if they're culpable. Some phones are dead. Some have bad breath or smell of piss. This is a hospital.
The phones are in the shopping centre, atrium cum cafe, and wearing cowls like hunched monks praying. They feed on cash, but are essential. Receivers hang like silent fetuses, and all trail cords twisted for messages. Among scratched numbers, cards for taxis, and torn wrappers, phones are dreaming grubby dreams. Beds glide by like barges with soft cargoes. Some phones are dead. Some have bad breath or smell of piss. This is a hospital. The phones are on the basement landing near the lifts, hooded like anybody cares what anybody says. Through dirty teeth they feed on cash. Receivers hang like unripe fruit and trail from vines like treble clefs. My call's essential. Of the phones, half are working. Some gag on coins like foie gras geese. People wearing coats or dressing gowns and bandages are waiting. Biro, grubby finger marks and scuffs patinate the stippled walls. There's fluff like tumbleweed. This is a hospital? The phones are in the shopping centre, atrium cum cafe, and wearing hoods like ram raiders. They feed on cash. Pale handsets trail from vines like ripening peaches. Silent drips, pumps, shunts, and beds glide by like wherries. Among evidence of crisps and gum, the vulnerable are wearing pyjamas and or coats or dressing gowns in their delirium. Incapable, clients hang their heads like hopeless phones. Some have bad breath or smell of piss. This is a hospital. Change is essential. The hoods of phones are lined along the walls of ill-lit corridors like inversions of urinals. Handsets turn their backs and hunch, dangling like limp kittens. Beds glide by like gondolas or rafts, while walking wounded cling to masts with drips for penance. Above floor tiles, puddled colourless with overuse and slippers, the phones slump senseless. Incapable, they hang their heads like apologetic doctors. Some are dead. What can I say? This is a hospital. A short poem to follow. John was discharged and readmitted several times, but finally he was home from hospital. Home from hospital. He wants to marry the day, see it keep its huge promises. He'd like to lock the past in a suitcase and every day decorate the table for Christmas. He creeps from room to room as each unwraps itself. In a colourful world, he stands pale as a sepia bridegroom. There's two more poems. I need a drink for the next one. This poem is based upon his daily drug regime. It's therefore deliberately long and repetitive, and it won the Barnet Poetry Competition some years ago. It's called Daily. Daily. I tell myself, there's nothing wrong with you that Cherry Active won't put right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you that 2 Cherry Active tablets won't put right. I tell myself, there's nothing wrong with you that vitamin D3 won't put right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you that vitamin D3 1000 IU capsules won't put right. I tell myself there's nothing wrong with you that desmopressin won't put right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you that desmopressin nasal spray 6 ml at 10 micrograms per actuation on demand won't put right. I tell myself, there's nothing wrong with you that thyroxine won't put right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you that thyroxine 100 mcg won't put right. I tell myself, there's nothing wrong with you that testo patch won't put right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you that testo patch 2.4 mg times 2, varying the position daily according to the chart, won't put right. I tell myself, there's nothing wrong with you that bromocriptine won't put right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you that bromocriptine 2.5 mg won't put right. I tell myself, there's nothing wrong with you that lansoprazole won't put right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you that lansoprazole 15 mg on an empty stomach and not within 5 hours of the thyroxine won't put right. I tell myself, there's nothing wrong with you that hydrocortisone won't put right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you. Hydrocortisone, 10 mg first thing, 5 mg at lunch and 5 mg with tea, but not after 6 and always with food, won't put right. I tell myself, there's nothing wrong with you that midodrine won't put right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you that midodrine 5 mg as needed, well spaced throughout the day, but no later than a 6 p.m. deadline, won't put right. I tell myself, there's nothing wrong with you that allopurinol won't put right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you that allopurinol 300 mg won't put right. I tell myself, there's nothing wrong with you that humatrope growth hormone won't put right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you that 6 mg humatrope growth hormone injected into your stomach nightly, but varying the site, won't put right. I tell myself, there's nothing wrong with you that meditation won't put right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you that 40 minutes of mindfulness-based stress reduction, sitting last thing at night and lying first thing in the morning, won't put right. And the final poem is called "And What Good Has Come of It?" And what good has come of it, I ask myself, having rung the bell to his house, where I too used to live before my marriage and his illness? What good? And I answer myself with the truth of 62 years, as I'm stood on one from the top of his steps on our birthday morning. And as he opens the door one step above, I look up as if into a mirror just a little distorted. And he throws up his arms and cries, "Let joy be unbounded! Let joy be unbounded!" I cry simultaneously, lifting my arms as if in the presence. It's spontaneous. There's no audience except passing motorists or passengers on the number 15 from the Heartsease. Nobody takes any notice except us. It's taken 62 years twice to reach this, and we're both smiling. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for another fantastic set. We will shortly be having a quick interval just so you can all stretch your legs, maybe get another drink. But before we do that, I thought it might be nice to hear a little bit about both of your extra projects. And I know that, Peter, you work with Poems in the Waiting Room. I wondered if that was connected at all to these hospital experiences that you've written about.
Well, I have an interest in the link between poetry and health. And that's shown itself in different ways, and is another reason why I read with Sally, because of her link between the poetry and health in mental health.
Poems in the Waiting Room is a national charity and used to produce these cards to be in GPs' waiting rooms so people could have something positive to read while they were waiting and they could take them away with them. And I had a poem accepted and published in there, and I don't remember, but I must have said, if ever you need any help, get in touch. Because eventually somebody did get in touch and asked if I could help with the submissions. So for the last several years, I've been submissions editor. People send me short, positive poems of some sort, not about brain surgery, I hasten to add, positive poems that might give people a distraction and some uplift while they're waiting for their GP. I collate them and send them through to the editor. Now, because of lockdown, people aren't waiting in waiting rooms anymore. So at the moment, they're being published every quarter online. But I have an anthology there, if anybody's interested, an anthology of the poems that have appeared in the cards.
Sounds like a really fantastic enterprise.
And shall I say some more?
Yes, of course.
Another angle on the health and poetry. My aunt didn't have children, the aunt who was frightening us in one of the poems there, and eventually developed dementia, and John and myself helped care for her. So I got involved in dementia care, and I won a competition run by the Alzheimer's Society, a poetry competition. So for a time I helped judge their competitions, and then I looked for a way to use that involvement locally, became a dementia friend, and started to run a poetry workshop for people with dementia in a local care home, a monthly session, which developed from me reading to them reading to me, and we were just getting to the point where the residents were starting to write their own poems, and it had to stop because of lockdown.
It's a really great use of poetry. And up next, after you've had a little break, we will be hearing from Sally, but I wondered if you might want to just talk a little bit about, as I said, other projects. You've got a new pamphlet coming out, haven't you?
Oh, yes. I've actually had 6 collections, all totally different. I remember the little bit of blurb on the back of my first pamphlet said that my poems were as varied as my interests. I'm going to read you a poem from it after. It came out only last month. It's got a wonderful cover that my publisher has made. They're 3 sculptures. And I'm going to read you a poem that will be about her sculpture. This is a woman sculptor who's not nearly as well known as she should be. Her name is Jermaine Richie, and she was French, and she lived in the Camargue, and it was very, very important to her. There's a queen and a king and a knight. They're 3 chess pieces. They're in the Tate Modern, and I probably saw them first time about 50 years ago. And they've got more of her work there. All the big art galleries, New York, the Louvre, they all have her work. And so it's not only about her, it's about the effect of work on me. In fact, the impact of visual art on the viewer. But I'll read you about that after my darling Derry, after you've been to the loo or had a chat.
Thank you. I hope that'll keep you all excited and waiting for the second half. But thank you so much, Peter, for a wonderful selection of your poetry. We will now take a short 5-10 minute break, and we'll be back to hear from Sally in her work. So thank you. Welcome back, everyone, to the second half of this poetry reading. We've had a wonderful section with Peter hearing his poetry, but up next we'll be hearing from Sally. And so, Sally, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about My Darling Derry, which is the collection that you'll be reading from. So, Sally.
Golly, that's a huge question that I'm actually going to answer as I read. Can I read from it?
Go ahead, absolutely. We'll bring the mic over to you and you can begin.
Thank you. There, prints. Moths, ghosts. My house is full of them. I live with waves of darkness, but their lives roar enormous through my rooms, hung on walls, locked in newspaper, stuffed in bookcases, tied with string, leaking from wounded suitcases. It rained last night, and the dead came down with the drops, to gather where the land is flat and wind-blown. The quiet stores their smiles. I press my finger where theirs have been, thread words to tumble them back, all talking, arguing. The moths and the ghosts are my father's family, and they're present in our house, in the pictures they've painted, in the furniture they've made, and in the books they've written. They're everywhere. I'm going to talk about 3 of them. This is my father, wearing an Eton collar. He's probably about 7. This is his Iarney, who is his 5 years older. And Iarney is a dreamy girl. She's a talented artist. She's very fond of poetry. She's never satisfied with herself. This makes her vulnerable. This is Ben, his eldest brother, who's 1 year older than Iarney, so 6 years older than my father. And he's brilliant. When he goes to King Edward School, they have to get a university teacher to teach him maths. He's so clever, nobody at the school can cope. The 3 of them. And it wasn't until I had this enormous archive of letters from the family that I decided that I must write about them, because when we were young, there was always a secrecy about my father's family. It wasn't, in fact, until I was an adolescent that I learned that they were both alive and both in mental hospitals. And it's these letters that tell the story so plainly that you wish that they could see at the time the clarity with which I could see that things were going wrong. I'm going to read now a poem by my paternal grandmother to her husband at 16 years after they've been married. And he's always away. He runs a furniture-making business, and he's very, very hard-working, incredibly. So she's lonely, and she's without the children because the 2 are away at boarding school. And there's always a problem about money in this family. She comes from a very well-off family. Her father ran Aberdeen, the Grand Hotel in Aberdeen, and there are lots of children, and she was the eldest. Her husband, my grandfather, came from a working class family, but he was brilliant. He started Bath cabinet makers, and he always had to add up money at the end of each week. And she's called on to do this, and you find that lots of the letters that I read by the children and by her mention money. It comes up over and over again. From Frances to her husband at Manchester's Midland Hotel, 3rd of April 1916. My darling man, I couldn't sleep without sending a little line. I've been very unwell, hardly out of the house. Yesterday was interminable. Today, your note. You are a real Wagnerian. I have but to wish, and lo. Eggs are dear everywhere. Somehow I must try to borrow £1. The villain wanted 2 and 6 for hot cross buns. Ben writes, shall I have pocket money Easter week? How I wish I could hug the boy. I miss him so. Ernie wants you to come back soon. Derry, she called my father Derry, is happy as a bird and very busy. I think sometimes I would heal if I could just get out, if I could forget the effort of each day. Imagine coming back to everything fresh, the effect it would have on my heart, to be strung once again by the joy of each season, to pick up the little bone-white driftwood bits of my life and be restored. Yours lovingly, F. I should point out that I have masses of books that Frances wrote, copying out poems, and every word I have used in the poem is from her letters. I didn't feel that I could add my own. Obviously, I've left out. There might be a whole lot of letters that I took the poem from. The third poem is a very short one. I have my father's diaries from the age of 14 till the year before he died in 95. And this one's called Derrick's Play. The last bit is in his words. Like an echo, he's at home, long after the others. The last child, alone with his mother. Charcoal, potassium, nitrate, sulfate, D. Richter, power display, January the 4th, after tea on Saturday. All my own fireworks. So even when he was that age, he was very keen on scientific, making experiments with science, and he wasn't the problem. The problem was Ernie away at school. This is a message from Frances again to her daughter Ernie the same year. And it's her words, remember. My darling little girl, are you better and going to lessons? I hope to come and see you, but have been very unwell. Derry and I gathered a huge bunch of orchids and cowslips from the field. We spotted a weasel by the hedge, and nesting birds in the front garden can nearly fly. Daddy is in London. Mrs. C has done the rooms. Derry and I are alone in this huge house. I must manage the ironing somehow. Much love to you, dear child. I think of you very often. I want my little girl to grow strong and well. Your loving mother. I'm going to jump. Ernie is now age 19. She's going to art college. And it is clear that she's talented. Her mother, as usual, is abroad. And Ernie is left in charge. I might have said that they weren't short of money. They just felt short. And believe me, it is quite possible to do this. She was left in charge when she was trying to study art. But The worst thing was that her father came home late from work or from when he'd been abroad, and he too was a talented artist, and he wanted to help her. But it was the one thing she couldn't stand, because every word was a criticism. And she would go to my father and confide in him. And he told me this. Ernie confides in her younger brother, Derek. At the academy, I try to paint the rhyming shapes and patterns of the sky. Father comes home and wants to help. But why does he criticize? It isn't meant to hurt. Derry, what can I do? The birds make scales and set off an alarm. It splits my head. I burn and belt it in. Then come to you. My fingers fumble the piano. It's a strain. The servants leave early when mother's away. Father makes his worries mine. I hear him say, "Oh dear, milk pudding again." I mustn't worry mother. Sometimes death seems the only way to solve the problem. How to fly. Will she hear my voice shut altogether? I'm going to do another skip. Because she's so often unwell and she has these blinding headaches, her father decides that he's going to send her on a painting course with a well-known painter. He was called Leonard Richmond. You can actually look him up on the web. They were in Étaples, and he was a considerable artist as well. And it was the highlight of her life, but there was a big but. Ernie's tutor, remember Leonard Richmond. "Your painting is better than mine," he said, and his words reached out and felt like love. He believed in her strength, where it might lead, and his words made music, and music moves. His words reached out and felt like love. "Come to Paris with me," he said. His words made music, and music moves, so they shared a bed. "Come to Paris with me," he said. If a voice hadn't hissed adultery, they'd have stayed together, shared a bed. But afterwards, she could only cry. If a voice hadn't whispered adultery, she'd believe in her strength and where it led. But after, she could only cry. "Your painting is better than mine," he said. What actually happened was that Leonard Richmond's wife, from whom he was estranged at the time, discovered that he'd been away with Ernie. And she contacted my grandfather, Ernie's father, who came down on the poor girl like a ton of bricks. People in his children didn't do that sort of thing. It was too much for her. She went back to St. Ives, where she'd been with Leonard Richmond, and she jumped from a high cliff. She was hauled out of the water with terrible wounds, very, very gradually, tended morning, noon, and night by her family. She recovered, but then she soon after discovered she had a schizophrenic psychosis, fell on her. Lots of cures were tried, but she was only 24 when it happened. She lived until she was 49 in mental hospitals. Of course, the stigma of that sort of thing meant that you didn't tell anybody you had a sister in a mental hospital. So that meant that my father, who was at school at the time, nobody else in the school knew that he had to weather it on his own. We've more or less forgotten about Ben. He lived in this high-achieving family, lots of stress to do things well. And he was offered a scholarship when he finished at Oxford to stay on and do whatever one did, master's degree then. But he didn't want to. He wanted a big family, a big car, and a big house. And so he joined his father's firm. But the war came, and nobody wanted to buy furniture. There was problems, and the war compounded problems he was having with shareholders in the firm. There was lots of stress. He had gambled, even when he was still at school. This one is the question of Uncle Ben, balance. And it's written 2 sides of the page. I was stuck, it's in his voice. I was stuck on a tightrope under huge unleafy trees, weeping for my sister. I looked down, but I wobbled, God, I wobbled. We were all shattered by her shattering. No one guessed the wretchedness I buried in my head, the sting of what I wouldn't admit, my barefoot steps along the line, the damage they bring. War, and the whole earth cracked. I wanted a trigger. I tipped. I lost my hair. Trees were my hair whipped stiff, like a blind white lava that couldn't pupate. I was breakable, but I didn't give in. No one knew how madly I gambled. I tried to walk on my hands. Articles went missing. Was it me the gardener saw, wandering aimlessly in town? But soon after this, Ben, too, was in a schizophrenic psychosis, and they tried all sorts of things on him, but it seemed to make him worse. What did my father do? It's a poetry of release, with a debt to W.S. Graham, whose work I've always been fond of. Derrick's efforts ran unhindered as the rain, those dearest to him from childhood, gone. He thought grief a gift he should earn. There's relatively little words can do for grief, but what else did he have? There were, he knew, huge worlds to share, explore. Let this poem be a still thing, a mountain constructed from glass. I begin with the ghost of an intention which blasts itself to nurture a new collision. Perhaps the shape of us, the wreckage, the shame, and the dance is in our language. This is my last poem. It too was a prize-winning one. I think you only need to know one thing about it. When I talk about the Rubaiyat, this is the translation of the Rubaiyat by Edward Fitzgerald. And I remember more than once, my father was very keen on his garden, like my husband. And I remember him tossing things in the garden and quoting. I think he knew the whole of the Rubaiyat off by heart. It's what Wikipedia doesn't say about my father. That these were the days of lobotomy, ECT, injections with testosterone, thyroid and Prolan, though nothing necessarily helped. That his sister was screaming God knows what, throwing her voices around the house. So he covered his ears. Years later, when he sang in his car, and it was a tune she played on the piano, the notes wept through him like ink in water. After a while, his brother went crazy too. My father didn't curl up. He burgeoned, had to solve a riddle, and it jerked him this way, that way, Such a wind. When he arrived at my bedside with his bike clips, I could hear his galactic heartbeat. That he didn't pretend to be perfect. Daytimes when we sang as we tramped and people passed us, and I was embarrassed, he went on singing. He needed to conform, but he didn't small talk. He jangled his keys, looked at his watch, and explored the scramble of proteins in the brain. That he fell in love with his garden, dug long into summer evenings, had a passion for sowing things, sugar snaps, runner beans, roses, pansies, pick them and they come again. Sweaty, showering soil, he invoked the rubaiyat. And look, 1,000 blossoms with the day woke, and 1,000 scattered into clay. When Ben died, this was 1946, Derek, my father, had already, he was a scientist, but he started retraining in medicine. And it was during the war with 3 young children. I'm the eldest one. He then got a new post as director of a research unit in a mental hospital. On the 30th of December, this is all from his diaries. On the 30th December 1950, he wrote, "Research is your job, schizophrenia your aim. Clear up all you can by the way, but the real aim must be kept constantly in view. It must be a fighting, thrusting struggle to beat that dragon, the long march to achieve mental health." Thank you.
Thank you, Sally, for a beautiful reading. I think what's lovely about both of your books is how they are dedicated to other people, you know, Peter to your brother and Sally to your dad. And I wondered, Sally, how you think your dad might have responded to the poems. They're quite personal. Was he quite open about these sorts of things?
No, not even his great friends knew. But I think everything had changed. I mean, in the climate today, I think he probably would be pleased. He was unusual in that he wasn't the slightest, he thought life was important. He wasn't the slightest bit interested in what people thought about him after his death, which was a pity. And I don't know, the amazing thing was that he was such a good father, that he was working absolutely long into every night when we were young, but we never felt, he gave us so much time. Every Sunday he'd take us for huge long walks. It was Whitchurch Hospital, so we had several years of my formative years, from 9 till I was 13, in Glamorgan, in a place called Radda near Whitchurch Hospital. And hardly anybody, nobody knew then that and he'd take us for these long walks, and then in the evening, in the winter, he would chase us around the house. And he played the piano all his life, and he would play games with us. He would thump and thump lots of pedal on the piano, and we'd the 3 of us would come in one at a time and sing little songs with him. We never felt short of his time. I mean, we had no idea at the time. And so I think the whole thing came back to me when I read the letters. What an unusual person he was.
And was it written in quite a short space of time, or was it a compilation over many years?
Writing?
Mm-hmm.
The book? Oh no, I wrote them, as Peter said, I write quite quickly. I had them on 2019. I mean, I wrote them within a year. About a third of the poems in this book are letter poems, and those ones are taken from the letters. But one of the ones I read to you was a pantoum, so there were other poems as well.
Do we have any questions from the audience about Sally's work? We have one. I shall come to you.
Sandy.
Thank you. Sally, could you explain to us the process of discovering the letters and sort of how you literally came across and your approach to reading them all? How did you plough through them quickly, or was it too traumatic?
It's funny that it's almost after. I mean, there were some like I didn't probably write them in the order they are necessarily in the book, but I would have a few letters. There were so many, hundreds and hundreds of them, and I would read a little group, and I had to sort them all out, because, for instance, my paternal grandmother, she never dated her poems, her letters. And so I got to know the letters really quite well. And I think when you read things like this that are having an impact, after a bit words seem to jump out at you. And I would have by my bed, which I still do, a hard file with a piece of paper on the top, and you start jotting words. And I had the letters, and I would words and then turning them into poems gradually. I don't know if that makes sense. You never quite know what you're doing, but suddenly some words seem necessary. Does that make sense? Yeah. So you take them down.
It's a fantastic description. If we have, as long as we haven't got any other questions, I think we should hear Sally's second reading. I'll hand over to you.
Well, I feel almost you've had enough of me. I'll only read 5 minutes on. I've told you about the book, that there were these chess pieces are some of the sculptures that I first fell in love with, and they're by Jermaine Richie, and she died rather early. Well, she was in her 50s. And she was working in Paris and kept going back to the Camargue and to that area in the south of France, which had meant so much to her. And it was not only the landscape, but all the animals in it. There was one of her pieces, in fact, I thought it was the best piece in the whole Liz Frink exhibition. If anybody here went, it was about 2 years ago in the Sainsbury Centre of Visual Art in Norwich. There was a Liz Frink exhibition, and one wonderful piece by Jermaine Richie was there, Storm Man. And anyway, I'm going to read a poem from the end of her life when she was working on chessboard. In fact, she finished it 4 months before she died. She painted them. Do go and see them when the Tate Modern opens. So she would go back to renew the landscape in herself. And the other thing, of course, that influenced her was war. They're all survivors. I think after COVID that we feel to some extent survivors, so we can commiserate. Echoes. In Bush de Rennes again, she remembered early morning. The dawn coming up under dusky sky, flotsam, beachcombing, foraging for wood, when Maron stripped her legs and stung. The hungry miles, 4 of them running like wild white horses, corralling black bulls. Toads sang, sun blinded their eyes. What she remembered was long afternoons, lyrical rhythms when heat shimmered off the dunes, when hoppers gathered in her hair, when a dead fox decomposing in the shallows lay gutted close to her lair. The beauty of wreckage, when spray sparked trinkets of glass, when waves broke in a million endings and darkness fell. What she remembered was evenings when a muted sun gave way to stars, when she lived outside, cried like a night owl, when bats' elocation bounced the air and the sky, being a darkish olive green, made an oversized chessboard of marsh and sand that focused her mind as stars came out and shadows closed in. The amazing thing is that because I was so keen on her work, Michael and I went to the Camargue, and we don't have wild white horses in Burnham over East Staithe, but it had sand dunes and marron grass and pine trees, and we swam in the sea there, and we felt so at home. It has lots of the same plants, and the sea lavender. As I say, I felt a terrific link with the sculptor who had made sculpture that I also felt a link with. Thank you. And I haven't said thank you, Florrie, for putting on this event.
Thank you to both Sally and Peter for putting on a fantastic evening. It's been so interesting and enjoyable to hear your stories, both of you. So thank you so much. And to everyone who's come along, both in person and everyone who are online. It's really nice to know that people were interested in coming along, and plenty more things like this will be happening in person and online, so do stay in the loop. You can find out about how to sign up to the Homestage mailing list if you go on our website, and you can be notified about any similar events like these in the future. But thank you again to Sally Festing and Peter Wallace for a fantastic evening. Thanks everyone for coming along.